Hello, I'm Jonasz Rewiński. Welcome on board the Eastern Express. As always, I hope you enjoy the journey. Now, on today's episode, we look at the implementation of the Black Sea Ceasefire agreement between the US and Russia and its implications for Ukraine. What does the deal mean for Kyiv? Can Russia be trusted with keeping its side of the bargain? Is it a tangible step towards lasting peace or just a smokescreen which allows Russia to shore up its military standing? Let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
After days of peace talks in Saudi Arabia, Russia and Ukraine have reached a provisional agreement on a naval ceasefire in the Black Sea, facilitated by the United States.
What we have here is an agreement in principle on a Black Sea ceasefire. We got two things from that. The first is we have more detailed definition of what the energy ceasefire entails. And the second is the principle, concept of a Black Sea ceasefire.
But in order to make the deal, the United States has made a commitment to Russia in a complete shift from Biden-era policy.
The United States will help restore Russia's access to the world market for agricultural and fertilizer exports, lower maritime insurance costs, and enhance access to ports and payment systems for such transactions.
For Ukraine, the agreement is a step in the right direction, though President Zelensky warned that Ukraine would push for further sanctions on Russia and increased military support if Moscow did not uphold its commitments.
The fourth point proposed by the American side is that everyone will work towards a lasting peace. Again, we're ready for this. We're ready to move fast towards an unconditional ceasefire and towards the next steps for a lasting and fair peace.
Despite the progress, Russia's insistence on lifting sanctions before the ceasefire's full implementation has complicated the path to peace, with Ukraine's officials stating that any movement of Russian warships beyond the eastern Black Sea would be seen as a threat to national security.
And now we're zoning in on the East-splaining portion of our show. The recent Black Sea ceasefire is not the first deal of its kind for the waterway. The Black Sea grain deal, established in July 2022, aims to facilitate the export of Ukrainian grain through its southern ports to the global markets. However, following a year of successful exports, Russia ended the agreement, citing unmet demands and sanctions concerns, leading to a disruption in global food supplies.
The Black Sea Grain Initiative, brokered by Turkey, the United Nations and Russia in July 2022, was a diplomatic effort to ensure Ukrainian grain could be exported safely despite the ongoing war. Ukraine, one of the world's largest grain producers, struggled to move its product through alternative routes, such as land transport via Poland and Romania. The deal allowed for commercial food and fertilizer exports from 3 Ukrainian ports through a humanitarian corridor monitored by Russian, Turkish, Ukrainian and UN inspectors. Over a year, the initiative successfully allowed 33 million tons of Ukrainian grain to be exported, stabilizing global grain prices and supporting low- and middle-income countries. The World Food Programme utilized a portion of this grain to assist countries in dire need, including Afghanistan, Ethiopia and Sudan. However, the deal began to unravel as Russia started slowing inspections and expressed dissatisfaction with the lack of progress in lifting sanctions on Russian exports, particularly agricultural products. By May 2023, food exports through the initiative had dropped significantly, and Russia ultimately decided to terminate the deal. Moscow's demand for clearer sanctions relief, including the unblocking of assets and resumption of agricultural machinery supplies, went unmet, contributing to the collapse of the agreement. Ultimately, Russia's withdrawal didn't stop Ukraine from exporting its produce, but the new US-brokered Black Sea ceasefire deal raises concerns whether Russia is able to commit.
And now, as always, it's time to examine the issue in greater detail. So, let's begin. Negotiations between Ukraine, Russia and the US over ceasefires in the Black Sea and energy infrastructure remain fragile, with Ukrainian officials expressing deep skepticism about Vladimir Putin's commitment to peace. They have warned that dealing with Putin is even more difficult than dealing with gangsters, arguing that the Russian president cannot be trusted to honor any agreement. According to them, US President Donald Trump may change his stance once he realizes that Putin is using peace talks as a tool for manipulation rather than genuine conflict resolution. A recent agreement aimed at preventing attacks in the Black Sea was immediately overshadowed by a Russian drone strike on the Ukrainian port city of Mykolaiv. While the US has indicated the deal was effective immediately, the Kremlin insists that it will not take effect until Russian state banks are reconnected to the global financial system, an outcome European officials have linked to a full Russian withdrawal from Ukraine. Russia also claims to have already paused energy attacks since the 18th of March, yet Ukraine reports continued strikes on its power infrastructure. President Volodymyr Zelensky has pointed to Russia's continued missile and drone attacks, including a major assault on Kryvyi Rih, as proof that Moscow has no intention of pursuing real peace. Zelensky has urged the US to impose additional sanctions in response. Meanwhile, the Kremlin has praised recent US-Russia negotiations, yet insists that a ceasefire depends on sanctions relief, particularly on Russian food and fertilizer exports. Foreign policy experts doubt that these talks will lead to a lasting truce unless the US applies more pressure on Russia. While Putin has little history of respecting ceasefires, experts note that he may tread carefully to maintain Trump's support, which remains strategically valuable for Moscow. And now, here to shed more light on the issue is Oleksandr Kraiev, director of the North America program at Ukrainian Prism. Hello and welcome to Eastern Express.
Yes, thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
So let's talk about the outcome of the negotiations in Riyadh so far. Would you agree that what was decided so far doesn't really look symmetrical in terms of being beneficial for both sides of the conflict? In fact, that some of the agreements that were reached might actually favor Russia.
That's definitely true. Unfortunately, we do see a lot of imbalancing there. We do see that, diplomatically speaking, some of the parts of the agreement, especially concerning the so-called grain route in Black Sea, and especially those concerning the energy infrastructure, well, the two main points of the agreement, does not recognize the Ukrainian input into this. Although, as it is known, because of Ukrainian counterparts being proactive, the American side did not come with a common press conference with the Russian negotiation team. At the same time, we do see that there are no barriers for Russia, basically, for their demands. There are no barriers for them breaching the so-called ceasefire, and there are definitely no mechanism of monitoring the successfulness of this negotiation and of their results. And once again, when we're speaking about the Black Sea and the grain initiative, well, Ukraine has conducted the grain initiative on its own for several years already. And this new proposal just gives the Russia a carte blanche to continue with this initiative by their own hands, without Ukraine or without any additional commitment on the Western side.
It's highly unusual, isn't it? Especially given that the question of ceasing hostilities in the Black Sea, that was never something that was raised by Ukraine. It only appeared during these negotiations. It was not an issue before that. As you've mentioned, Ukraine has pretty much managed to carve out this sort of secure corridor by driving the Russian Black Sea fleet away using drones. So now, why do you think this is what we're seeing at this stage? Why do you think America seems to be rather submissive, or at least willing to recognize Russian arguments more so than the Ukrainian ones?
Well, that's a hard question to address, especially if we speak about the, short time lapse of the interview. But to put a long story short, first of all, we do see a lot of willingness on the side of Donald Trump himself and his negotiating team to reach some kind of agreement, some kind of a peace deal draft as soon as possible. There are also rumors, diplomatic rumors, that Trump is willing to reach some kind of a ceasefire agreement by the 20th of April. So basically he lacks time. He is on his deadline and he is willing to make these sacrifices on behalf of Ukraine.
It's a very ambitious time frame.
He's willing to make Yeah, so this time frame is quite harsh on him, and that is why he is trying to be very soft on Russia. That's the first approach to this task. The second one is, of course, we know that Trump is kind of in a liking with dictators. He's the one that said that he wants to be praised like Xi Jinping or Kim Jong-un, or he wants to be praised like Putin. And so his approach to negotiating with dictators always differ from his negotiation with his democratic counterparts. That's the second point here. And the third point, well, basically, Ukraine put everything on the table firsthand. So we presented all the plans, all the strategies, everything. And Russians, well, Russians are playing by the Soviet handbook. They're not presenting any concrete results, any concrete end game scenarios. And so they're playing one step at a time. And this time they chose to play this safest step, and that is proposing a grain corridor in the Black Sea.
They're also multiplying their demands. They said that some of what was essentially agreed in Riyadh is going to be conditional upon the US enabling the Russians to re-enter the global trade insofar as foodstuffs are concerned. Also, to the proposal concerning the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, the Russians simply said, no, it's impossible. We're not going to yield our control over this power plant, which we, the Russians, have stolen from Ukraine before that. Do you think that there might be a red line beyond which Donald Trump is going to say, okay, we're not buying this anymore? He already indicated that he can see Russia dragging its feet. Could this be an indicator that his patience might be running out?
Well, it should be an indicator, let's put it that way. Well, basically, because we spoke with you concerning the very harsh deadline on Trump and his negotiation and his willingness to conduct some kind of agreement really quickly. And so basically, Russia will just enforce its demands on Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, on grain corridor in Black Sea, on anything else, on the prohibition of attacks on energy infrastructure, on oil infrastructure. They will just continue to add up more compromises. They will just continue to add up more profits for themselves. That's basically a part of the so-called Gromyko diplomacy, named after famous Ministry of Foreign Affairs Andrei Gromyko from the Soviet Union. His idea was to stack up as many demands as possible before your counterpart will be willing to exit this negotiation. So as of now, Russia will definitely continue to stack them up. And for Trump, this idea, this approach of Russia to negotiation should be a signal that Russia is not willing to make any concessions and Russia is not willing to make any kind of a working deal. And if we speak about Trump personal preferences, his preference is just to get Ukraine and Russia at the negotiating table. And some way or another, he should find out that Russia is not willing to be a cooperative counterpart. Russia is not willing to cooperate on Trump's ideas. Russia is only standing for Russian interests.
Now, where does Europe stand in all this? We're actually looking at the Paris summit on Ukraine today. Too early to say anything specific, but the talks are directed at creating this sort of coalition of the willing. Russia so far has refused any possibility of European or NATO troops taking part in the enforcement of the ceasefire. But how can Europe really change the calculus here?
Definitely, from the point of view of Ukrainian foreign policy, Europe is inalienable from the peace process. Europe is an indispensable part of Ukrainian security, not only guarantee-wise, but also peacekeepers-wise, but also industrial-wise, also economically-wise. So basically, Europe is something that will definitely help Ukraine withstand any potential continuation or renewal of Russian aggression. We do see that the United States, unfortunately, are not willing to take the toll on that. They're not willing to be present. They're not willing to support Ukraine more, or even willing to support Europe as it was after the Cold War. So basically, Europe must stand on its own, and Ukraine is something that will definitely bring more security to Europe, because with Ukrainian experience, with Ukrainian army, which is currently one of the biggest continental-wise, with Ukrainian readiness to fight to the bitter end, Europe should do more for Ukrainian security, because it's not the issue of Ukraine per se. it's the issue of European security. And so from the point of view of Ukrainian foreign policy, only together with Europe can Ukraine create a wholesome, grounded, comprehensive security strategy. So basically, once again, from the point of view of our president, of our Minister of Foreign Affairs, only together with Europe can Ukraine create this strategy in order to present it to the United States as the backbone, as a baseline, so to say, of any further negotiation. So basically, it's not a Ukrainian peace plan anymore. It is European Ukrainian peace plan. And so in that regard, this concrete negotiation in Paris, which is taking place right now, as you rightfully said, they will eventually create this framework of this whole European security strategy, which then will become the integral part of the future agreement. Of course, you rightfully suggested that Russia will not take into account European interests. They will not benefit from anything that Europe will do. They, of course, oppose any kind of peacekeepers or any kind of European NATO involvement, but at the same time, they are not omnipotential in that. If Ukraine will be when Ukraine will be a part of European Union and when Ukraine will have a comprehensive security agreement with European partners, well, Russia will be in no position to dictate the presence or non-presence of foreign powers in Ukraine.
Do you think that Russia may respond to this by trying to soften Europe up? For example, all these talks about Nord Stream 2, it's not super official yet, but we already have Sergei Lavrov mulling the idea that some US companies could get involved and then the US administration could force Europe into not rejecting a deal for Russian gas. And again, there might be politicians, especially those from the far right in Germany, for example, they openly said, we want Nord Stream to get back on track. Do you think there is a risk that Europe right now will be even more of a target of hybrid warfare from Russia intended at influencing elections, meddling in democratic processes, and ultimately producing a situation whereby the unity might be broken and Ukraine will be left, if not on its own, then at least not backed by all the European countries, because Russia still does have all the means to interfere with our democracies, right?
You're absolutely right, but at the same time, we were in such situation starting 2024, before the so-called election year, when most of European and non-European democracies went to the exit polls and went to the voting booths to choose their new politicians. It was a distinct risk not only for Europe but for the whole coalition of support of Ukraine that mostly far right or far left parties, both of which does believe in closer ties with Russia, will be victorious in this election year, will be victorious in most of the European democracies and especially in European Parliament. But at the same time, we do see that the new political elites are mostly pro-European, mostly pro-Ukrainian, and they can come up with a coalition decision on continuing the support for Ukraine. Of course, it is true that Russia will still uphold its covert influences. They will still conduct this malicious hybrid warfare, very meticulously described by General Gerasimov in his famous article. But there is something that Russia was doing for the last 20 years, basically. Even Nord Stream 2 is already considered a part of the hybrid economic warfare of Russia against Europe. So Europe is quite well prepared for this kind of provocations. Of course, we do still have Viktor Orban of Hungary. We do still have Robert Fico of Slovakia, who are quite anti-Ukrainian and sometimes even quasi-anti-European. But it's something that Europe also can deal with. Of course, you mentioned Americans. The Americans are also a black swan here. They can play into Russia's hands. But a small comment here. Let us not forget that oil and gas companies were the main lobbying economic powers behind Trump's campaign. What is more profitable for American oil and gas companies? Getting Russia back on the market or getting the market for themselves after the era of Biden when they were prohibited to enter European market? Well, basically, I do not think that Trump, being a self-proclaimed businessman president, will lose such a great deal to get American oil and gas back to Europe.
So, of course, this is very much a developing story, and hopefully some of what we said today may turn out to be true, in that a pragmatic and forward-thinking approach will prevail, and that war criminals will not be rewarded for their actions. This is what we are often talking about with respect to Vladimir Putin. Oleksandr Kraiev was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insights.
Thank you very much.
And now we're moving on to Eastern Newsflash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you really don't want to miss. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky arrived in Paris on Wednesday for talks on security guarantees for Kyiv ahead of the Coalition of the Willing summit set for Thursday. During the meeting, French President Emmanuel Macron announced 2.2 billion euros in military aid for Kyiv.
The new aid package includes anti-tank rockets, air defense systems, missiles for Mirage fighter jets and armored vehicles. This adds to the 6 billion euro in military support France has provided since the start of the Russian invasion. The leaders of over 30 countries, including Germany, Poland and the UK, met in Paris to discuss support for Ukraine's post-war security and developing a long-term peacekeeping coalition, following a proposal by UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer in early March.
US Secretary of the Treasury Scott Bessent stated that all options, including reincorporating Russia into the SWIFT banking system, are on the table in the ongoing Ukraine-US-Russia negotiations. In an interview with Fox News, he emphasized that any future actions would depend on Russia's leadership and their next moves.
What I can guarantee you is that there is...
According to the US Secretary of the Treasury, Scott Bessent, Russia could soon be reconnected with the SWIFT banking system. Bessent emphasized that any decisions would depend on Russia's actions and noted that President Donald Trump would not hesitate to impose further sanctions if deemed necessary. Bessent also touched on an economic partnership document that is under review by Ukrainian officials, following failed rare minerals deal that had been disrupted by tensions between President Zelensky, Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance. The new version of the agreement is significantly larger than the original, with hopes for full discussions and signatures in the near future.
A Russian court has sentenced 23 Ukrainians captured during the siege of Mariupol to prison terms of 13 to 23 years on terrorism charges, a verdict Kyiv calls a violation of international law. The convictions come nearly 2 years after the trial began in Rostov-on-Don and include members of Ukraine's Azov brigade and support personnel.
The trial saw 11 of the original 24 defendants convicted in absentia after returning to Ukraine in prisoner exchanges, and one defendant died in custody. Among the convicted are 14 members of Ukraine's Azov brigade, which Russia has designated as terrorist group, and others who served as support personnel. The defendants were charged with staging a violent coup and organizing terrorist activities during Russia's siege of Mariupol, which ended with the surrender of around 2,500 Ukrainian fighters in May 2022.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates. I'm Jonasz Rewiński. Bye for now.